The Quiet Season. Chapter 1. The Sound of Dust. The house had been silent for so long that when the clock in the hallway began to tick again, Eleanor flinched. She had replaced the batteries that morning, a small act, almost meaningless, yet the sound filled the old rooms like breath returning to a chest. She stood in the doorway, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, listening. Tick, tick, tick. It was both comfort and reminder. Time moving again. Outside, the October wind carried the dry smell of leaves and the faint murmur of students walking past the edge of campus. The university bell tower, she could still see it from her kitchen window, chimed 11. The sound used to summon her to lecture halls and department meetings, to rooms full of eager faces. Now, it only marked the hours between small domestic rituals. She had retired in May. They had given her a plaque, a bouquet of tulips, and a speech that used words like legacy and mentor. She had smiled. She had even laughed, though something inside her had folded in on itself, quietly. For 38 years, Eleanor Brooke taught modern American literature to students who alternated between reverence and apathy. She taught Baldwin and Morrison, O'Connor and Updike. She believed in stories as mirrors, as bridges, as small salvations. But that was before the silence grew so loud it followed her home. Now, she lived in the house her parents bought in the 70s, 2 stories of aging wood and creaking pipes. The air smelled faintly of books and cedar. The garden had grown wild since June, the rose bushes reaching out like unpruned sentences. That morning, she decided to clean the study, not because it needed it, but because she needed a reason to stay standing. The study was her favorite room. The walls were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, though most of the books were gathering a thin, gray film of neglect. She touched the spines as she passed, whispering the names: Didion, Mailer, Bishop, Cheever. They were her company now. At the far end of the room, near the window, stood her old desk. Oak, scarred, reliable. The top drawer was stuck, as always. She tugged it open and found what she wasn't looking for: a stack of letters tied with red string. She froze. The handwriting was hers. And his. His name was Samuel. He had been a visiting professor once, for a semester that lasted longer than it should have. Philosophy, ethics, and a laugh that filled corridors. She remembered his eyes, sharp, amused, and always a little tired. They had written letters back and forth long after he left. Not love letters exactly, but something close enough to make her heart ache decades later. Eleanor sat down, the chair groaning under her. Her fingers trembled as she untied the string. The first letter was dated March 3rd, 1989. She began to read. Ellie, you were right about the story ending before it begins. I reread A Good Man is hard to find, and I think you were right about that, too. Grace comes too late for most of us. But it comes. That's the part one keep holding on to. Her throat tightened. She could hear his voice as she read. Calm, deliberate, edged with that half-smile he used when he disagreed with her. She turned the page. Another letter. And another. Each one carried a ghost of ink and rain. Small talk about books, long talk about loneliness. The last letter was undated, but she knew it was the final one. The handwriting had grown unsteady. If you ever come to Maine, there's a cabin by the water I still keep. Sometimes I think I built it for us, though we never said that aloud. The key is in the same place it's always been, under the 3rd step. She folded the page and sat very still. The clock in the hallway ticked on. Outside, the wind had shifted. Maine, she said aloud, testing the word. It felt strange in her mouth, foreign and familiar. She hadn't been there in years, not since a conference in Portland, long before the world became smaller, quieter. For the first time in months, she felt something stir. Not quite hope, more like curiosity with a pulse. That evening, she made soup she didn't finish. She poured herself a glass of wine and turned on the old record player, though the vinyl hissed more than it sang. Ella Fitzgerald's voice filled the kitchen warm and imperfect. Eleanor swayed a little, her bare feet tracing the faded tiles. When the song ended, she went to her desk again. She opened a blank page in her journal and wrote 3 words. Drive to Maine. She stared at them for a long time. The next morning, she called her sister, Margaret, in Vermont. Ellie, you're up early, Margaret said. Her voice was brisk, practical. I found something, Eleanor replied. Old letters. From Samuel. There was a pause. That name still carries weight, I see. It does, she said softly. Margaret sighed. You're not thinking of. I am. Oh, Ellie. Eleanor smiled. You don't have to approve. I never do, Margaret muttered, though there was warmth beneath the words. When are you leaving? Tomorrow, maybe. It's time to see what's still there. She spent the day gathering things she hadn't touched in years. An old map, her father's compass, a faded scarf that still smelled faintly of lilac. The air outside had the first bite of approaching winter. The trees along the street had turned the color of old gold. As she locked the door that night, she hesitated. The house looked different in the dim light, less like a refuge, more like a place waiting for someone else. She thought about the university, about the colleagues who had drifted into emeritus titles and quiet illnesses. She thought about her students, the ones who still sent Christmas cards, the ones who vanished into the fog of adulthood. Mostly, she thought about Samuel. The letters had survived, but did the man? At dawn, she loaded her car, the old Subaru that smelled of coffee and chalk dust, and began to drive north. The highway unfurled before her like a memory she hadn't finished living. Towns gave way to stretches of forest, then to the cool expanse of the coast. Somewhere near Bangor, she stopped for gas and a cup of weak coffee. The attendant, a young man with tired eyes, smiled politely. Long drive. Maybe, she said. Maybe not long enough. He laughed, unsure what she meant, and she liked him for it. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of slate. The air smelled of salt and pine. She followed a narrow road that wound along the coastline, where the sea appeared suddenly between the trees, gray, restless, endless. When she saw the mailbox, rusted, leaning, with his name barely legible, her hands began to shake. She parked by the gate and sat for a moment, watching the cabin at the edge of the clearing. It looked smaller than she remembered from his descriptions, the wood darkened by years of weather. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney. Smoke. That meant someone was inside. Her heart hammered as she stepped from the car. Each footstep on the gravel felt impossibly loud. She climbed the 3 wooden steps. The third creaked under her weight. She bent down, brushed away the damp leaves, and found the key exactly where he'd said it would be. Her reflection wavered in the window. Older, grayer, a little braver than she felt. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell hit her first, cedar, salt, and something faintly metallic like old coins. Inside, the air was warm. The fire crackled softly, and then she heard a voice. Ellie. She froze. The voice was rougher than she remembered, but unmistakable. Samuel, she whispered. From the shadows near the hearth, a man stepped forward. His hair was white now, his frame thinner, but his eyes, they were the same. Sharp, amused, a little tired. I thought, he began, his voice breaking slightly. I'd imagined you coming here one day. She stood in the doorway, unable to speak. He smiled, slow, uncertain. Well, he said, you took your time. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of rain and sea. The waves crashed somewhere beyond the trees, steady and patient. Inside, time, that old, stubborn thing, seemed to pause. Eleanor felt the silence stretch, and for the first time, it didn't feel empty. Chapter 2. The Years Between. The fire had burned low by the time Eleanor found her voice. You're here, she said quietly, though it came out more like disbelief than greeting. Samuel smiled. A small, crooked thing that looked borrowed from another time. I could say the same to you. They stood like that for a long moment, 2 people suspended between what was and what might still be. The air hummed with things unsaid. Eleanor closed the door behind her, the sound sharp in the hush. "I didn't think anyone would be here," she admitted. "I didn't think anyone would come," he replied. The cabin was smaller than she expected, a single room divided by a wood stove and a table scattered with newspapers and empty mugs. A half-finished crossword lay open, the pencil resting diagonally across it. The smell of coffee mingled with ash and the faint tang of ocean air seeping through the cracks in the windows. She took it all in: the worn armchair, the books stacked in uneven towers, the old radio humming static. He had built a life here, quiet and unadorned. "Sit," he said finally, gesturing toward the armchair across from his. "Unless you'd rather keep me standing trial." She laughed softly. "That depends. Are you guilty?" "Probably," he said, and poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. His hands shook slightly, just enough for her to notice. They sat facing each other, the fire painting their faces in uneven gold. Eleanor studied him, the lines carved deep around his mouth, the faint tremor in his right hand, the slowness of his movements. Age had gathered in him gently, but it had gathered all the same. "I thought you were in New York," she said. "Last I heard, you were lecturing at Columbia." "I was, until I wasn't." She raised an eyebrow. "That sounds evasive." He smiled faintly. "Retired. Officially. Unofficially, let's call it being forgotten." Eleanor looked down at her cup. "I know the feeling." The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was layered, thick with memory, softened by time. He leaned back in his chair. "You still teaching?" "No. Retired in May. Voluntarily. Mostly." He chuckled, the sound catching in his throat. "You always did leave a door half open." She smiled despite herself. "And you always walked through it." The conversation drifted towards safer ground: weather, books, the small indignities of aging. He told her about the storms that came in from the Atlantic, how they shook the windows and scattered pine needles across the porch. She told him about the university's new president, a man who quoted data instead of poetry. For a while, they were two old professors trading observations about a world that had gone on without them. Then, as dusk fell and the wind began to rise, she asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since she'd opened the first letter. "Why did you stop writing?" He looked into the fire. The flames flickered against his face, highlighting the shadows under his eyes. "I didn't know what else to say," he said finally. "You'd married. I thought that was the right time to stop." She felt the words like a stone skipping across still water. "Yes," she said slowly. "I suppose it was." He glanced up. "You loved him?" She nodded. "In the way you love someone who steadies the room." He was kind, predictable. He believed that love was a sort of discipline, quiet, reliable, unremarkable. "I thought that was enough." "And was it?" She hesitated. For a while, the wind rattled the windows. A log in the fire collapsed with a sigh. Eleanor stood and walked to the bookshelf beside the door. The spines were familiar: philosophy, poetry, old paperbacks swollen with damp. She ran her fingers across the titles until she found one she remembered: Letters to a Young Poet. "You kept this," she said. "You gave it to me," he replied, "with a note I never returned." She turned, frowning. "What note?" He nodded toward a drawer in the table. "Top one." "Go ahead." She pulled it open. Inside was a folded page, yellowed and fragile. Her own handwriting stared back at her, slanted, impatient. "If you ever stop writing, I'll come find you." She looked up. "You kept this all these years?" He shrugged. "I didn't think you meant it. Until now." They both laughed, softly, almost shyly, and something eased between them. Night settled fully outside. The sound of the ocean grew louder, the tide pulling close. Samuel rose and threw another log into the fire. "Stay the night," he said. "It's a long drive back, and there's a guest room, small but warm." Eleanor hesitated. "You trust me not to haunt the place?" "I'm counting on it," he said, smiling. Later, she lay in the narrow bed under a quilt that smelled of cedar and smoke. The house creaked around her like it was exhaling. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving, the soft shuffle of slippers, the kettle whistling, the low hum of a radio tuned between stations. She thought about the years that had stretched between them, the missed chances, the small betrayals of time. She had always believed life was a linear thing, a story moving forward. But lying there, she realized it looped and doubled back, folding over the same moments until they found their way home. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it carried her into dreams of classrooms filled with sunlight and voices she almost recognized. In the morning, the world was wrapped in fog. The sea was invisible, but she could hear it breathing beyond the trees. Samuel was already awake, seated at the table with a book open and a pot of coffee beside him. He looked up as she entered. "You sleep?" "Enough," she said. "You?" He smiled. "I never do." He poured her coffee and passed her a slice of toast. For a while they ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the occasional cry of a gull. Then he said, "There's something I need to tell you." Eleanor set down her cup. "That sounds ominous." "It isn't," he said, though his eyes told her otherwise. "It's just necessary." He stood and walked to the small window overlooking the trees. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of what he was about to say had already settled there. "I'm not well, Ellie." She felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" He turned to face her. "The doctors call it idiopathic. Some rare thing with the blood. They've given me time, but not much. A year, maybe less." The room went very still. She wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The sound of the clock, tick, 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 filled the silence again, cruel in its steadiness. Finally, she managed. "You should have written." "I did," he said softly, "but I never sent it." He reached for a small box on the counter, opened it, and handed her a stack of envelopes. Each one had her name written in the same familiar hand. "I wrote these every winter," he said, "after the snow came. I didn't know where to send them. You'd moved, changed departments. And after your husband passed." She looked up sharply. "You knew?" He nodded. "I read your piece in the Atlantic. The one about grief in gardens. It was you, even without the name." She laughed once, bitterly. "I thought I was being discreet." "You never were," he said, smiling faintly. She sat back, the envelopes heavy in her lap. "So what now?" she asked. He hesitated. "Now we remember. Or try to." Eleanor looked toward the window. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing a line of dark pines and the silver thread of the sea beyond them. She thought of all the years she had spent teaching others to interpret endings, how she had spoken of closure as if it were a literary device instead of a wound that sometimes refused to heal. She looked back at him. "Then let's start remembering." He nodded. "There's time yet." They spent the day walking the coastline, slow and careful. The sand was cold beneath their shoes, the air sharp with salt. He told her about the first winter he'd spent in the cabin, when the sea froze along the edges and the pipes burst in the middle of the night. She told him about her students, the one who cried over Baldwin, the one who plagiarized Wolfe with surprising sincerity. They laughed more than they expected. By afternoon, the sky cleared into a pale blue, and the light turned the water into glass. Samuel paused at the edge of the tide and looked out across the horizon. "Funny," he said. "I used to think this view would be enough to keep me company." "Was it?" she asked. "For a while," he said. Then, after a pause, until now. When they returned to the cabin, he lit a lamp and she made tea. The day had left them both quiet, thoughtful. Eleanor watched the shadows move across the walls and realized how easily they had slipped back into something that felt almost natural. Not youth, not romance, but the calm recognition of two people who had survived the same storms. She said softly, "You know I'll have to leave again." "I know," he said, "but not yet." The words lingered between them, as tender and uncertain as the space they shared. Later that night, as the fire dwindled to embers, she opened one of the letters he had never sent. The date on the top corner read, January 4th, 2002. Ellie, I still think of that afternoon in Boston when the snow came down so hard we couldn't see the street. You said every storm was a kind of forgiveness. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. The snow hides everything, but it also softens the world. Maybe that's what time does too, if we let it. Her vision blurred. She closed the letter carefully and set it aside. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the pines. Somewhere in the dark, a fox barked once, sharp and clear. Samuel had fallen asleep in his chair. The firelight flickered across his face, and for a moment, she saw him as he had been, young, laughing, leaning against her desk, arguing about endings. Eleanor stood, drew the blanket from the back of the chair, and placed it gently over his shoulders. Not yet, she whispered. Not the ending yet. Chapter 3, The Shape of the Days. The mornings came quietly now. The light arrived slow, pale through the fog that clung to the trees, and the air in the cabin smelled of coffee and damp wood. Eleanor had fallen into a rhythm, one that belonged neither to the past nor to the world outside. She rose early, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and sat by the window while the kettle hissed. Samuel would be reading already, always at the same table, his glasses slipping down his nose. Sometimes he underlined a line, murmuring it to himself like a prayer. Those mornings had their own language, the clink of cups, the sigh of the fire, the soft thud of his pencil on paper. No university bells, no deadlines, no students waiting for her to fill the air with meaning. Just time, slow and unguarded. Do you ever miss it? He asked one morning, not looking up from his book. The teaching, she said. He nodded. She thought about it, tracing the rim of her cup. I miss the faces, the start of the semester, the sense that something was about to happen. And now things just happen, without warning, without purpose sometimes. He smiled. That's closer to truth than most syllabi ever were. Eleanor laughed, shaking her head. You always did find virtue in chaos. And you always tried to organize it, he replied. Someone had to. They began keeping a small journal together. Samuel found an old ledger in the cupboard and set it on the table. Not letters, he said. Letters belong to the past. Let's call this a record. Each day, they wrote a few lines, sometimes about what they'd read, sometimes about the tide or the birds or the way the fog moved like breath over the sea. It wasn't much, but it felt like a kind of survival. By November, the air had grown sharper. The mornings started with frost on the windows, and the evenings came early, pressing the cabin into shadow by 4. Samuel tired more easily now. Some days he stayed in bed until noon, though he never complained. His humor stayed intact, dry, mischievous, refusing pity. Once, when she offered to chop wood for the stove, he gave her a look that made her laugh. I'm not dead yet, he said. I didn't say you were. You didn't have to. You had that tone. What tone? The one professors use right before they tell a student they're worried about their progress. Eleanor smirked. Maybe I am. He grinned. Then give me extra credit for effort. As winter deepened, they began reading aloud in the evenings. Sometimes poetry, sometimes bits of philosophy, but often novels they'd both taught once upon a time. He chose The Great Gatsby first. She protested. We've read it 100 times. He shrugged. That's why it's safe. Familiar disappointments. He read slowly, his voice rough but steady. When he reached the final lines, so we beat on, boats against the current, Eleanor felt something twist inside her. The words, once overanalyzed into exhaustion, felt new, personal. Do you ever regret it? She asked. The choices we made? He looked at her over the top of the book. All the time, but not tonight. Snow came early that year. Thick, quiet, unhurried snow that softened everything it touched. Eleanor stood at the window watching it fall. The world outside had vanished into white, and for the first time in a long while, she felt completely still. Behind her, Samuel spoke. You remember what you said in Boston? About storms being forgiveness. I do, she said. He nodded toward the window. Then we're forgiven. She smiled, though her throat ached. You're impossible. True, he said, coughing lightly, but occasionally poetic. By mid-December, his health began to slip in ways neither could ignore. He slept more, spoke less, and when he did, his words came slower, as if weighed down by invisible gravity. Eleanor moved quietly around him, making soup, tending the fire, pretending not to notice when he winced. One afternoon, she found him outside on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the gray horizon. The wind off the ocean cut cold, but he didn't seem to feel it. You'll catch your death, she said gently. He smiled faintly. Too late for that. Don't joke. I'm not, he said, but his eyes softened. I just want to see the water. It changes every hour. You wouldn't believe how much you can learn from watching it. She sat beside him. Then teach me. They watched in silence as the waves rolled in and broke against the rocks. The sound was steady, eternal. After a while, he said, I used to think the sea was a metaphor. For time, for regret, you name it. But I was wrong. It's not a metaphor at all. It's just the sea. Eleanor looked at him. And us. He smiled. We're not metaphors either. We're just what's left. She reached for his hand. His skin was cold but alive. He squeezed her fingers once, briefly, like punctuation. Christmas came quietly. They didn't decorate, but she baked bread, and he insisted on reading A Christmas Carol by the fire. He did the voices, badly, and she laughed until tears gathered in her eyes. When he reached the part about Scrooge awakening to find himself alive, he paused. See, he said, redemption's always possible, even for cynics. Are you calling me Scrooge? She asked. I'm calling you saved, he said. The words landed gently, but stayed with her long after he'd fallen asleep in the chair. In January, the storms came hard. The wind howled against the roof, and the trees bent like supplicants in the dark. Power flickered on and off, but the fire kept them warm. Samuel grew thinner. His hands trembled constantly now, and his voice faded to a whisper. One night, as she adjusted his blanket, he opened his eyes and said, You're not afraid anymore. She looked at him, startled. Of what? Of time? Of endings? She hesitated. I suppose there's no point. He smiled faintly. There never was. The next morning, he was worse. He could barely stand. She helped him to the chair by the window, where the light was softest. Stay here, she said. I'll make tea. He caught her hand. Ellie. Yes. Promise me something. Anything. When I go, don't stay in this place too long. Don't let it turn into a shrine. Promise me you'll keep moving. Her throat closed. You think I'd just stop? I think you try to write the ending perfectly. And life doesn't work that way. She managed a shaky smile. You'd know. He slept most of the day. She sat beside him, reading aloud from a worn collection of Bishop's poems. The wind pressed against the windows. The fire burned low. When evening came, the sea turned black, and the first stars appeared, faint and cold. Samuel stirred once, opened his eyes, and whispered, Tell me something beautiful. Eleanor thought for a moment, then said, The sea is still moving, even now. He nodded, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Then his eyes drifted closed again. He was gone by morning. The fire had burned out. The air was still. The sea, outside, continued its endless rhythm, indifferent and constant. Eleanor sat beside him for a long time. There were no tears at first, only the hollow quiet that follows the final note of a song. When she finally rose, she opened the window. The cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of salt and snow. Goodbye, Samuel, she whispered. You taught me how to stay. The weeks that followed passed like pages turning themselves. She stayed through the thaw, cleaning the cabin, sorting his books, reading their shared journal. Each entry was a fragment, weather, memory, laughter, silence. Together, they formed something whole. When spring finally broke, shy and pale, she packed her car. The sky was wide and blue, and the air carried the faintest warmth. She stood at the porch, looking out toward the sea one last time. There, in the ledger, she'd written a final line. The quiet season ends, but the tide never does. As she drove south, the road curved through forests bursting with green. The world felt new again, not because it had changed, but because she had. She would go back, not to teach, not to retreat into memory, but simply to live among the noise again. She thought of Samuel, of his voice quoting Baldwin, of his laugh. She thought of the sea, the endless motion of it. And for the first time in years, she whispered aloud, "Let it keep moving." Chapter 4, The Return. The drive south felt longer than she remembered. The roads were the same, winding through familiar towns with names that sounded like half-forgotten poems, but the distance had changed. It wasn't the miles. It was the weight of what she carried, the silence that now had a name. Eleanor stopped once, at a diner off Route 1, the kind of place that smelled of bacon grease and nostalgia. A waitress in a faded blue uniform refilled her coffee twice without asking. "Headed somewhere?" the woman asked, her voice friendly but cautious. "Home," Eleanor said. Then, after a pause, "I think." The woman smiled like she understood. "That's a long trip for a maybe." Eleanor nodded. "It always is." By the time she reached her town, spring had begun to lean towards summer. The dogwoods along the main street had burst into white bloom, and the air carried the faint sweetness of cut grass. Her house waited, unchanged. The ivy still climbed the porch rails. The paint still peeled in the same reluctant strips. Inside, the air was musty, a mix of paper and dust and absence. She set her bags down and stood in the doorway, listening. Tick, tick, tick. The clock in the hallway was still ticking. It startled her how alive that sound felt. The first night back, she didn't sleep. She walked through each room like a visitor, touching the edges of things, the books on the shelf, the framed photograph of her students, the dented kettle on the stove. Everything seemed smaller than before, as though the house had been quietly shrinking in her absence. She made tea at midnight and sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker against the branches. The sea was hundreds of miles away, yet she could still hear it in her head, that endless hush, that rhythm that didn't stop when life did. A week passed before she saw anyone. It was Margaret, her sister, who arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning. She came armed with groceries and a kind of gentle impatience. "You look thinner," Margaret said, studying her. "And older." Eleanor smiled. "That tends to happen." "Was he?" Eleanor nodded before she could finish. "He was." Margaret exhaled. "I'm sorry." They sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight spilling through the window onto the tulips Margaret had brought. After a long silence, Margaret said, "You're not going to stay here forever, are you?" Eleanor tilted her head. "Where else would I go?" Her sister smiled a sad, knowing smile. "Anywhere you haven't already been." The days settled into a quiet rhythm again, but it was different now. Eleanor spent the mornings in the garden, cutting back what winter had left wild. She discovered violets under the overgrowth and a robin's nest in the lilac bush. Every small thing felt like a message she didn't quite understand but wanted to keep reading. She began to write. Not letters this time, and not lectures, just fragments, reflections, small attempts at naming what she'd seen. Sometimes she wrote about Samuel, but mostly she wrote about the spaces he'd left, the silence, the calm, the quiet weight of grace. One afternoon, she walked to the university. It was early June, commencement week, and the campus buzzed with the same restless energy it always had. Students moved like bright birds across the green, tossing caps and laughter into the air. She stood at the edge of the crowd, unseen, content to watch. For a moment, she thought she saw one of her old students, Claire, maybe, or Thomas, but the face dissolved into someone else's. The bell tower chimed noon. The sound rolled across the quad, deep and familiar. Eleanor closed her eyes and let it wash over her. It no longer hurt. She stopped by the English department out of habit. The halls smelled of chalk and coffee. Her office door had a new name on it now. She stood there for a moment, reading the letters. Dr. Rachel Navarro. A young woman stepped out just then, startled to see her. "Oh," she said, smiling nervously. "You must be Professor Brooke." "Once," Eleanor replied. "I've heard about you," the woman said. "They still use your syllabus for the modern American course." "That old thing," Eleanor laughed. "It's probably due for burial." "Or resurrection," Rachel said lightly. "I'd love to hear how you chose those readings." Eleanor studied her, the eager eyes, the way she held a notebook too tightly. It was like looking backward in time. "Maybe someday," she said gently. "But for now, it's yours." That evening, Eleanor sat on her porch with a notebook balanced on her knee. The sky burned orange, and the air carried the smell of rain. She wrote, "We spend our lives teaching others how to read stories, and only at the end do we realize we were trying to read our own." Then she stopped, smiled, and closed the notebook. A breeze rustled the ivy. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed, bright and fleeting, like the chime of a small bell. She felt something uncoil inside her. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was close enough. In late July, she received a small package in the mail. The return address was a law firm in Portland. Inside was a single envelope, handwritten in a familiar hand, though shakier than before. "Samuel's." Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. "Ellie, if you're reading this, the sea has probably outlasted me, as it should. Don't mourn me long. I had the good fortune to end my story with you in the room, and that's more than most can say. Take what we learned and keep walking. There are still books to read, still mornings to see. When the tide pulls back, remember it always returns. Yours, still somewhere in the sound of the waves. Samuel." She sat very still. The air around her seemed to hum, not with sorrow, but with recognition. Later, she drove to the small lake on the edge of town. The water there was calm, almost mirror-like. She read the letter again, folded it carefully, and let it slip from her hand into the water. The paper floated, then sank slowly, as if the lake itself was taking it in. She whispered, returned. Autumn came early that year. The leaves turned gold and drifted across her garden, and the mornings brought that same crispness she'd known by the sea. Eleanor began teaching again, not formally, but through a small community class at the library. Literature and Memory, she called it. A modest circle of retirees, nurses, widowers, a young man studying social work. They read quietly. They talked honestly. Sometimes, when the room grew still, she could almost hear Samuel's voice, amused, tender, asking one of his impossible questions. And she'd smile, not answering, letting the silence do the work. On the last night of class, she read aloud from their shared journal, a small passage written in his hand. The days don't disappear. They change shape. They stay inside the ones who remember them. She closed the book and looked around the room. That, she said, is what stories do. They stay. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then someone began to clap, soft and sincere. Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen, and for the first time, she didn't resist it. That night, she returned home to the sound of rain on the roof. The house no longer felt empty. It felt lived in, like breath, like memory, like music fading but never gone. She made tea, opened her notebook, and began to write again. Chapter 1, The Quiet Season. She smiled at the title, then crossed it out and wrote. Chapter 2, The Returning Tide. Outside, the rain deepened, steady and sure, echoing like the sea she still carried within her. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt ready to begin again.